Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. It's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the things that many of us in the world are doing now is making New Year's resolutions. It's a natural time where we think about hitting reset, hitting some change button in our life. And here in January at Good Faith, we're going to do a series on hitting reset on some areas of our life. But I want to take a particular angle to this, which is I want this series to address the reset buttons that we may tend to ignore. They may be the settings that are buried deeply in the menu that we don't even know are there perhaps, but actually may have outsized importance on our life precisely by being somewhat hidden from our view. And the example I want to use to start off our series on hitting reset is hitting reset in our relationship to alcohol. And why do I choose that one? Well, if you take New Year's resolutions as an indicator of the areas in our life that get a lot of attention, that demand a lot of sense that we should be changing it, you look at the top New Year's resolutions made by Americans. Now, according to Forbes Health, 3 of the top resolutions are all around improving fitness, losing weight, improving diet. And that's not a surprise. I mean, this is a year we are inundated with messages, articles to feel better, look better, eat better. If that's your New Year's resolutions, more power to you. That's great. Important to address those issues. And of course, this is why we see gym memberships and diet plan subscription spiking. I think those are important goals for fitness, weight, and diet. But what about alcohol? If you actually look at impact on well-being, according to the CDC, there's about 300,000 deaths related every year to obesity-related deaths, right? To our distorted relationship with food. When it comes to alcohol, it's not that far behind. It's almost close to 200,000. So, food is only about 1.5 times more impactful on health, at least measured by this metric of death caused by it. But when you look at New Year's resolutions, alcohol comes nowhere close to diet, weight, and so forth. Roughly about 35% of folks choose some sort of weight or diet related resolution as their top resolution. For alcohol, it's 3%. So 3%. It's not even anywhere close in the top of the list. And yet it really is within shouting distance of some of the most impactful areas of our life that may need to be addressed. And yet we are way over indexed, some 20 times more attention. If you go by the metric of New Year's resolutions, 20 times more attention paid on food than alcohol. And yet both are within shouting distance of impact on us. And so I think that's an example of one of these more hidden reset buttons that we tend to ignore. So I wanted to address that topic to lead off our series, because I think that's actually an important lens. Alcohol is an important lens for us to examine which reset buttons do we pay attention to and which do we tend to ignore, or are we even told it's okay to ignore. So for you, if you're listening and you're listening now and you're like, I'm sure I don't have a problem with alcohol, I just invite you to listen in, because maybe that confidence you have is actually part of the dynamic we need to examine and penetrate to get at some of these reset buttons. Or if you're almost like absolutely certain alcohol is not a role in your life. By the way, that's me. I don't drink at all because I'm Asian and I get the Asian flush, and I just look like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer if I even have a sip of a wine cooler. So I don't even drink, but I'm fascinated by this issue precisely because of this dynamic, because I think alcohol is a window into maybe other areas of my life that I tend to ignore, downplay, think it's not important, but I actually need to consider hitting reset. And so for this conversation, which is both about alcohol and both about this larger issue of which resets do we pay attention to in our life, I was so excited to have as our guest, Ericka Andersen. And by the way, we're going to have this conversation, as you'll quickly hear, not just with Ericka, but with Hank, Ericka's dog. Ericka Andersen recently wrote a very well-received article about this very topic in the Wall Street Journal that got my attention. She's a freelance writer focusing on faith, culture, motherhood, politics. She's been published in the Wall Street Journal, like I mentioned, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christianity Today. In her past work, she worked in communications for the National Review with our friend David French at the Heritage Foundation, and from 2009 to 2011, the Republican House Conference. So she's, has a lot on her bio, and included on her bio, in addition to personal facts like she's a wife and mother of two, there's this interesting fact that's out there on her bio that she is 4 years sober. So we're going to talk about that. Ericka, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you so much. I didn't know we were going to go way back to my days on Capitol Hill, but it's there. So
you can't escape it. The internet follows you everywhere, Ericka. And you're always, and so that means people forever are going to realize at some point, Ericka, you proclaimed yourself as 4 years sober, which means there's a story there for somebody to come out with that in their bio. Tell us the story.
Oh, wow. Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to think where's the best place to begin, but I guess it's just like my family history, in that drinking has always been a part of my sort of our family culture, not in a negative way necessarily, but just like it was always there. And so like many people, I began drinking in high school, just sort of for fun and, whatever, not a big deal type of thing. But I quickly realized even then in high school that there was something off about my relationship with alcohol. And so as far back as 18 years old, I was saying to myself, I should probably quit drinking. And part of that was because I was a Christian and I knew that drunkenness was a sin. So that was one side of it. But the other side was like, why do I feel compelled to have as much as I do have? And why am I making decisions that I probably wouldn't make if I wasn't drinking? And so even back then, which was a very long time ago, I started to have those feelings. But I went on to college, young adulthood in Washington, D.C., which D.C., last I saw, is maybe the number one most alcoholic city in the entire country. If you've ever been a part of that environment, you know that things revolve around happy hours. There are drinks everywhere. I said the other day to someone, it's almost like sometimes you feel like you're going back to the 1960s where people are having 3 martini lunches.
Right.
It's very accepted to drink basically all the time there. And so it was very easy for me to just sort of dive into that lifestyle and give myself the excuse that I'm just a normal 20-something. This is just what we do. It's fine. All along, I knew it wasn't fine. Because of the, ultimately some of the choices I would make while drinking and just the way that I felt convicted as a Christian. But I was able to sort of push that away and just sort of ignore it. I remember thinking, well, I can't stop drinking. I'm in my 20s. Like, that's ridiculous. Things like that. But ultimately moved on to, I got married, I had kids. And so drinking became less of a going out, hanging out with people thing to more of an at-home type of thing where, oh, it's 5:00 and I have to make dinner and the kids are fussy and life is hard and stressful and I need an escape. And so it was the stress of just daily life, which I had a good life. I had a good job. I had a good marriage. I had a good children, everything was going as well as it could go. And yet I had this compulsion to drink and this feeling that I couldn't explain. I sometimes said it felt like nothingness or just this mysterious thing that I wanted to get rid of. And the only way I could do that was to drink. And so I had been doing that for so many years that I just kept doing that, even though in the back of my mind, I felt like this isn't healthy. It's not good for you, XYZ. And so, but as time got on and I started to get older, I started to think things like, are you still going to be dealing with this when you're 75 years old? Like you're not in your 20s anymore. And, more research and information was starting to come out about the way that alcohol affected your health in such a negative way. Like we started seeing that come out. Whereas like previously it was more like, oh, a glass of wine keeps you healthy. But I started seeing maybe the algorithm started feeding me other information and alternative information. And so I saw that. And, around that time in my mid-30s, I started to get curious about what would it even look like to like change this relationship. Like I wouldn't even say quit. I just was like Googling like how to moderate am I an alcoholic? Just all of these things, like looking over my shoulder, hoping nobody would see me, because there was no one in my life that would tell you Ericka has a drinking problem. And I think that's the thing about a lot of maybe women. I focus specifically on women a lot of times, although can apply to both. But a lot of times you don't know when someone has a drinking problem. You can be a perfectly functional, high performing, happy church going wife and mother and be struggling with this underneath the surface, and no one would ever know. And so I think there's a lot of people like that hiding out, I would say, maybe even in our churches. And so that's one reason I want to bring it to the light to talk about.
Well, Ericka, you said you took a long time for you to realize you had a problem in your relationship with alcohol. If you could be a good friend to all your listeners and you'd be like, you know what? Here's the questions you ought to be asking yourself right now, before it gets to the point where it's so obvious. What would be some of those questions you would pose to people?
Well, first of all, I would say it doesn't necessarily have to get too obvious. It's more of like the question of, is my life better with alcohol or without alcohol? No, I like to say, you don't have to hit rock bottom. You don't have to have something awful happen to choose to stop this where it's at. It doesn't have to get bad. It may just be something that doesn't make you feel good, and that's a good enough reason to quit. But I think, yes, there's a lot of self-awareness that can go into this, and I encourage everyone to just start with a curious approach. I'm never going to tell you, hey, you need to quit drinking right now. And like, that's it. And that's all you can do. It's more about getting to the heart of why you think you may want to quit, or why do you drink? Like, we need to explore these questions about, why do I drink?
Mm.
What happens when I drink? What are the patterns in my life that bring me to this place? And then learning about what alcohol is, what it does to your body when you drink, and like how that affects you, body, mind, and spirit. There are so
Mm.
many questions that you can begin asking, and you could just kind of start writing this down in a journal, whatever it may be. But the first step is just to explore. I read a book, and I always recommend this book, This Naked Mind by Annie Grace.
Mm.
That's, I say, best book to start with, because it's very pressure off. I believe she even says in the book, you can read this book while you're drinking. I don't care. Because it's not about like, you must quit drinking. It's about, well, let's educate ourselves and decide
Yeah.
whether or not this is something that's good for our lives and something that we even want. And once you know some of the things that I learned in that time period, you cannot unknow them. And you have a very different perspective on alcohol, what it is, what it does, and why you're choosing to use it. You also begin to get into the context of other people who have been able to stop, and you realize, like, wow, there are a lot of people doing this, and it's not like some weird, you have to be a weirdo.
Ericka, your answer is really interesting because you are steering clear of this very straight, black and white, you might call fundamentalist line about alcohol, like that tells us either never drink or only up till this many drinks. I think many of us are temperamentally wired to want a very clear line, in or out, good or bad. And you are telling what seems to me a more complex story. And I especially like the way you talk about the relationship with alcohol, because you're talking about alcohol not just as an inert substance, but almost something as a a quasi being, if you will, something that we actually not, it's not a personal being, but it's something we have a relationship with. And as almost all relational things, they differ from people, from person to person. So unpack that a little bit more. If we really wanted to explore thoughtfully our relationship with alcohol, what are the relational categories that we need to be employing? Because it almost seems like we most need to use relational categories like, am I becoming overly dependent? Am I looking to this person to meet a need that this person can't need? Does this person exert control over my life? Again, I'm putting ear quotes around person, right? But I think it seems like if we're talking about a relationship, it's helpful to, in some ways, personalize this presence called alcohol to discern its actual role in our lives. So how do we do that? Help us do that.
Yeah, it really is like a codependent relationship. In fact, I
Mm.
was just writing about this the other day in my email newsletter, about how when you stop drinking, it really is a grieving process because
Oh, interesting.
so much of, if you're a person like me who, I quit drinking in my later 30s, my entire life since I was a teenager, alcohol has been a part of vacation,
Mm,
celebration. It's been a part of, weddings, holidays, parties, friendships. It
right.
is so interwoven into all of these really important times in my life that you
Yeah.
can't imagine doing all those things without it. As silly as that sounds, that is those things go together with alcohol.
Yeah.
And so that honestly was one of the harder things for me in the very beginning. I was like, well, how can I go to a concert without drinking? Like
Yeah.
that won't be fun,
So alcohol has always been my buddy for that.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And you think that you need that for things to have the meaning that they have. But the
Mm,
reality is that you didn't experience those things without alcohol. So you don't know what actually was sort of the magic ingredient. And it turns out, as it turns out, it wasn't the alcohol. It was all the other special details, the people you were with, the things that you were doing, the
mm,
experience that you were having. Like, our brains can't sort of disentangle that until we
mm.
actually do it without the alcohol and realize that all of those things still have deep meaning and we can still have fun and we can still have those experiences, except for now we remember them better. They
Huh.
actually have a deeper meaning because like we appreciate the moment in a different kind of way. You just don't think as clearly or as in-depthly when you are drinking. That's just, it shuts off part of your brain. And so I do think that it's not just like it isn't, it seems so silly to say, oh my gosh, this substance, this liquid is like the problem here. Like it's just a bottle of liquid. But it's so much more than that to us as people who have had alcohol as part of our lives. And so I think that it's okay to look at it that way and realize like it's not easy to break up with someone that's been part of these special times
Yeah.
in your life, and it's okay to have a grieving period. I feel like I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because we were talking about the curiosity portion, but
Yeah.
ultimately um the beginning of the breakup, no matter what kind of breakup, is the hardest part, and
Of
that is
course.
true with
Yeah.
alcohol as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you're almost when you're describing that effect that alcohol had on all of these experiences, the picture that came to my mind was this very loud, large presence. Like, I mean, in my mind, it's like college frat boy. Like that's just the image that I have. I'm sorry, but who I remember in college, that personality would come in the room and just dominate the social situation such that you couldn't really attend to anything else because that person just wanted to be the center of attention, would interrupt every conversation, would just basically shut all other sort of smaller subtle interactions down. And it's almost like that when you have alcohol, that's that presence that you're bringing into it such that your ability to tune in to deeper, more subtle meanings,
Mhm.
relationships, dynamics in your life gets drowned out. And I think that's really helpful because we can sort of focus on the health impacts of alcohol to as a motivator. And I eventually want to talk about that. But you're talking about, look, there's a way in which if we can actually get in a better relation with alcohol, we tune up not just to our physical health, but our relational, mental, spiritual health, because we can actually tune in to these other sources of meaning, of joy, of love, of connection that right now that big frat boy just drowns everybody else out.
Yeah.
And so did you tell me how that, like what were some new sources of deeper, perhaps more subtle, but deeper precisely because they are more subtle, of meaning that got freed up for you because that big presence was exited?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say, in terms of the frat boy analogy, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think, for example, a lot of people will say that they started drinking or sometimes continue to drink because of social anxiety.
Mm,
They want to be able to talk to people at parties, or they've always felt. I've heard a lot of people say when they start drinking, they feel like they're normal. It makes them feel normal. Or people will say that about drugs as well. And when we do that and we've trained ourselves that way, we've trained our brains, and it does change the way that it does, like rewire your brain. to believe that without that substance, you can't be normal or you can't speak to people in a social setting. And so when you don't have it, like if it's not available to you or whatever, it creates this fear or panic, or, you know, you just like, you've given your brain a message and your brain believes you.
Right.
Which is why the process of letting go of alcohol is really retraining your own mind and retraining your brain, which thankfully our brains, like, I'm no neuroscientist, but from what I understand and what I've read, like our brains are malleable in that way,
Yeah.
and we can retrain them to think differently, whether it's about this or something else. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. In terms of the depth, what you're saying, like things that I would notice after quitting drinking, I think you are more likely to notice like the inflection in someone's voice or the look in someone's eye. You're more likely to hear the unspoken things that someone else may be saying or doing. When you're drinking, your faculties kind of glaze over the smaller, more subtle details
Right.
of life. And so whether that be something that's wrong with your child, maybe like something that's kind of just itching or something that's bothering them, or like an issue that your friend is having that you would normally notice if you weren't
Yeah.
drinking, like you miss these little details
Yeah.
that we are more attuned to in those ways. But you also miss things like, I remember thinking one of the things was just like this sober laughter. That was a big thing for me. Like just really like laughing so hard in a group setting when there's no alcohol. It's like such a better, different laughter than
Yeah.
drinking laughter. And I don't
Yeah.
necessarily know how to describe it, but it's just so pure and genuine.
Yeah.
And it's one of the best things. And it usually happens to me. I always find in my small groups at church, like we always just laugh so much. I don't know what it is,
Yeah.
but a lot of inside jokes, I guess. But, but there are things like that you see, and also that you notice more so as someone who came away from alcohol. One of my favorite authors on this topic is Laura McCowan, and she has a book called We Are the Luckiest.
Uh-huh.
And the reason she named her book that is because she says, we're so lucky that we went through all of that. And now here we are on the other side, and we can appreciate so much of the life that we have today. We can appreciate those little moments that we finally realized that we were missing all of those years we were drinking.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true. There's so much to appreciate here on the other side.
Yeah. Ericka, there's so much to unpack in what you just said. A couple things. One, I realize that, in my own mental picture of when we say, what is your relationship with alcohol like? I'm speaking a little bit as an outsider because I don't drink. And so as you were describing about the person who's socially anxious, who's nervous, I almost then picture alcohol as actually kind of as a confiding friend, somebody that sidles up to you and kind of reassures you, pats you on the shoulder. And that's another kind of relationship that you may have that, seems really benign, helpful, but leads you down some pathways that, are really problematic. The other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about was just about this, which all the research now shows about how alcohol shuts down certain parts of our brain, that especially is the parts of our brain that's required to be activated to perceive deeper meaning, deeper clues in the other person. Malcolm Gladwell has written about this in making the connection to why, especially among young people, so much of this epidemic of date rape is connected to teen drinking. And what he argues is what's happening. It's not just that alcohol is suppressing inhibition in, let's just say, stereotypically the male person, which it is doing that, but it's also shutting down all of the or much of the ability to pick up cues of the other person, the female, saying no, and it just that's erased that sensitivity that normally governs human relationships. That's at the level of going down a very disastrous path, avoiding a very disastrous path of a date rape. But you're also talking about it also closes off those deeper interactions, because in my experience, in a party, in an interaction, at least for me, and maybe this is me as an introvert, but I think this is true, the most memorable parties, social experiences I have is when I get into a conversation that goes deeper, that somebody actually reveals something about how they're really feeling, how they're really doing. That is a confiding, a vulnerability that they are giving me as a gift. But no one, it's like, declares, yes, I am miserable in my marriage. I've never told anybody. Now I'm ready to tell you, right? That comes out in little clues, little subtle gestures, comments, and so forth, that you've got to really have an antenna up to pick up and ask the right sensitive next question, to pick up, how much is this person really wanting me to go there? How much are they inviting me? What's the next step? That's a high level degree of awareness that, again, I think what you're telling me is that alcohol shuts all that down. So it almost invariably precludes you from that gentle, delicate, careful relational pathway you need to go to have those deeper, more meaningful, more memorable conversations.
Yeah. And I mean, I think as Christians also, like, we are always, or we should at least be on the sort of have our radars up for like whatever God is doing in the moment and
Mm,
however God is working in someone's life. And I think, the Holy Spirit works through us as people of faith. I sometimes envision, you know, that we have like a light, like an invisible light around us, like as Christians, marching through the
mm,
world. But something that I often say is that the Holy Spirit and the spirits of alcohol are like oil and water, and they don't work
oh,
together. And I truly
mm,
believe, now this isn't straight from scripture exactly, but from my own experience, is that the Holy Spirit does not do a good work in me when I'm drinking. It really
right.
seems that to cancel it out. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because, like, I remember in college, I would like I would be that person, that really annoying person that at like 1 a.m. I'd start talking about God, and people would be like, "Oh, there she goes again." And I don't know why I did that. Probably because I felt guilty. But it's interesting because I don't think that we are going to be, up to the task of like God's work in the world if we're drunk. And
Yeah.
of course, you can drink without getting drunk, but many times, like, even a buzz, I would say, is not great, because that your perception is still limited, and your guard is still down, and you
Yeah.
are not going to be in tune to that more supernatural thing that may be happening.
Right. Well, I think this is exactly why Paul talks about warning against drunkenness. Why it's actually a precluding condition for anybody in leadership, because precisely, I think what Paul's saying is, you will not be sensitive to the Spirit. The Spirit, like you said, is like oil and water with the spirit of alcohol. And I think we've articulated at least one reason why that is because the Spirit whispers. The Spirit is gentle. The Spirit is
Mm-hmm.
subtle. The Spirit does not shout. The Spirit does not, slap you on the back of your shoulder. Whereas alcohol is so much louder. It drowns out the
Yeah.
subtle, quiet voice of the Spirit. That's a really helpful insight. And Ericka, I also think I really like the spirit by which you're talking about this, that it is not this legalistic thing. It is a invitation from God to pay attention to Him, to His people, to His movement in the world. And it's like you need to choose for something better, because if you're simply saying, I need to refrain from something that actually feels good at some level, that's a very difficult motivational base
Mm-hmm.
to hit the reset button. Like, we need the vision, the picture of something better. um, Ericka, can you give a story of when you sort of had that, oh, this is the better that I
Mm.
was missing? Is there a story or an example that particularly comes to mind?
Let me think here. I mean, I think there's so many moments. I mean, just waking up in the morning feeling refreshed is one of
Mm,
them.
yeah,
So many
yeah.
times, if you're, you know, a drinker, that can be anyone. Like, there are plenty of people who are like, I only drink on the weekends, right? But they binge drink and they still feel like crap. And so I was more of a like nightly wine person. And so,
Hmm.
like, most mornings, I didn't wake up feeling great. And I would constantly be sort of renegotiating, okay, so how much can I have, and how much water I need to drink, and how much food do I need to eat, and what time do I need to get up? And, I'm doing this, and I have these little kids, and I like want to make sure, it was like it was like a grid in my mind where I'm trying to move things around and make sure it ends up okay in the morning. And it's like, I don't ever have to do that again. I don't ever have to like try to plan out all of these things, because I know that tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up and I'm going to feel good. And it's interesting because like the couple times that I have had the flu or been sick, where you kind of feel that similar feeling to as you would to being very hungover, I'm like, this is not fair. I do not drink anymore and I should never have to feel like this again. Of course, we can't get rid of the flu. But the point is that there's so much freedom in that. And also, when you're in this place of try to moderate your drinking or set rules for yourself or whatever, it's always on your mind. You're always thinking about it. You're always like, planning things around what, where you're going to be, if there's going to be alcohol, if you're going to drink, if you're going to drive, who's going to, and so now, I can say very, very confidently over 4 years after giving alcohol up, like, I just don't think about it. I mean, occasionally, yes, it'll come up, or like sometimes I have dreams that like I'm secretly drinking and I'm like, well, it's fine. It was just once. Like you can still tell people like, you'll have those dreams. But the reality is that once you remove it, it's gone. And it's hard to believe that when you're still in it, but I can tell you, I never think about it hardly at all now.
I think there's just really great lessons here that I want to invite our listeners to reflect on. Again, even if alcohol for you really is not the reset you need to hit, to apply some of what we're talking about here to whatever that may be creeping up your mind and consciousness, whether it's social media, pornography, gambling, to really, rather than just do a yes, no binary, is it okay, is it not okay, to do this more curious, subtle, and in some ways, actually, it sounds like, frankly, more risky exploration of what is my relationship to this presence, to this substance, to this behavior. What is it doing to me? How much is it crowding my life? What is it crowding out? What am I not being able to be present to in terms of experiences in the world or relationships with loved ones because of this presence? Like, these are the harder questions, but they seem to be the really ones that get at the heart of, whether we need to hit reset or not, and also tap into deeper motivations for making that reset. I just find that, when we do a very legalistic approach, sometimes it helps us get started to do it, but it's very rare that that's a sustainable sense of motivation. We need to tap into, what am I getting back? What have I lost because of not hitting this reset? And if I hit reset, what do I gain back? And that involves this kind of relational exploration. Ericka, we're having this fascinating conversation about our relationship to alcohol and the possible need to hit reset in it. And by examining that question, whether we need to hit reset, we're asking some questions that are applicable not just to alcohol, but to any other substance or activity in our life, which is, what's my relationship with it? What is this thing doing in my life? What is it preventing me from doing it? What is it making me do? We haven't talked about the physical health component, Ericka. And I think one of the reasons why certain buttons don't get hit reset is because the messages we get that downplay how important they are in our life. I think about this with gambling right now. Gambling has gotten legalized. It's just widely viewed as a fun, sociable activity that you can inject more interest and energy in sports. Yet I think in about 5 or 10 years, we're going to see with gambling what we're now seeing with social media and teens, which is this host of factors that are deeply destructive.
Also marijuana.
In our lives. And marijuana, we're going to see this again with marijuana, again, because people are not being thoughtful enough in saying, what is this doing in our lives, and are exposing ourselves to some very deeply addictive substances. And with alcohol, it seems like we're starting to catch up to that, because for so long we had the literature of, a little bit of wine, 2 glasses a day. That's what kept the Italians so healthy. Can you speak a little, I know you're not a medical expert, can you speak a little bit about what were some of the new emerging research that was persuasive for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think just understanding that alcohol is like a toxic substance, like it's like a poison basically that you're putting in your body. It's not necessarily like drinking actual poison, but it is a poison to your body. And so like when you think about when you're hungover, when you feel sick because of drinking, that's your body saying like, I didn't want this. Why did you give this to me? This is bad. And it's not just those immediate reactions. It's like when you look years down the road at people who have been drinking for many years, what you'll find is that They have higher rates of heart disease and heart attacks. And now we're seeing cancer. The American Cancer Society has now said 0 amount of alcohol is good for if you're trying to prevent cancer. We see breast cancer rates. That was a big one for me. I noticed that breast cancer rates were higher in women who were, I guess, moderate to heavy drinkers. But I mean, January, even though it is a low percentage compared to fitness and food, like it still is probably the number one month that people do try to give up alcohol for a month.
Yeah.
It's usually these 30-day challenges. And I think it's like, if you decide to do that, the question is why? Like, what is it about alcohol that you think you need to take a break from? And I think you'll find some answers in there about why, if this isn't a bad thing, why do I think I need to give it up for 30 days?
Yeah. Ericka, we've been talking about just now about the health information that we didn't get from the medical community, but we are now finally starting to get more from the medical community. Let's talk about the other messages we get from other communities and how it has shaped our relationship to alcohol. Why does it take so long for people to realize I may need to hit reset?
Well, I think most people that drink don't want to stop drinking. And so a lot of times it's just not like a point of conversation, because people, like, they're like, okay, good for you, but I'm going to be over here. I'm going to keep drinking my wine, it's just sort of like a topic that people feel like, I think if they engage with it, then they sort of have some kind of accountability to participate. So I think that's one
or feel judged by,
or feel judged.
if somebody judged,
right. Feel judged. And then also just like social situations, it doesn't matter. Almost every social situation includes alcohol. Like, even sometimes church things, like not necessarily, like my church would never have like alcohol there, but like at a small group event or a Christmas party or something like that. And I'm not saying like, oh, you should never have any alcohol anywhere. But I do think particularly for the church and for Christians, like, you should be a lot more sensitive to it, because as I said, you don't know who's struggling. Like, you really don't. And so I can tell you from personal experience in the past, when I've been in those situations where there has been alcohol in a setting where I wasn't expecting it, I was very disappointed, because I thought I was getting away from that. This is like a place where I'm like going to connect with God. And like, now there's wine here. And now that like totally, toxifies the situation for me. But outside of that, I mean, I think people are just not aware. And these days it's less common that Christian alcohol is not allowed thing. Like, that's just sort of like not that popular anymore. Like the legalism and people worry about seeming legalistic. And even I remember thinking to myself, like, I don't want people to think I stopped drinking because I'm a legalist. Like, that I'm just like, oh, I'm a Christian and I don't drink.
Yeah.
Like, no,
that's almost worse than being alcoholic, Ericka. Is like, so.
Like, I'm not one of those. But I just, maybe somebody thinks that, I don't know. But it's just, you have to not care about that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if there's a way to do that, but precisely by having a more nuanced conversation, which is tricky to have, but it seems like what we're saying is actually what you need to have, which is actually being the person who, because you're not drinking and you're open to the Holy Spirit's prompting, being open to small signs in your friends' lives that, wait, actually, this may be something you may need to consider. Like, if, let's say you're that person listening to this and you're thinking about a friend, a loved one, or family that you want to actually be the one who's paying attention to the small signs that, you may have a distorted, a damaging relation with alcohol. How would you even begin that process as a friend?
If you think that your friend has a drinking problem?
Yeah, a friend, a loved one, or something like that.
I think I would maybe just like open the door to the conversation. Like, oh, I heard this interesting podcast, or, oh, this book looks.
Hey, share them this podcast and then say, what do you think?
Right. Or just like, oh, even just like talking about your own, like, I'm thinking about like doing a 30-day cleanse, like alcohol just makes me feel gross, and sort of just testing the waters to see what they say. Because just even one of those comments might be like, have them say like, yeah, you're right. Like, or like, oh yeah, alcohol makes me feel like crap. Because I think it depends on how close your relationship is. Of course, I think if it's like your best friend or your spouse or something, you'd probably be a little bit more direct. But just to sort of dip a toe in the waters of where their mind is, if there's an issue, I think that they'll probably give you a clue. And then that opens the doorway maybe to more conversation in like a no pressure way. But wanted to say earlier that I'll just say now is that this curiosity, no pressure approach, I think is really important, because when we are in a place where we feel that we have to do something, you
Yeah.
have to quit drinking, it's so much harder than when we're saying, I'm choosing this in the freedom of
Mm.
my knowledge and in the freedom of, like, I have the autonomy to choose yes or no. And also for me, it was very much like, it's okay. Like, God, like, you are redeemed. Like, if you continue to have this problem for the rest of your life, like, you're still going to be in heaven with Jesus, right? But God has something better for you here on earth if you would choose to trust him in this. Now, you're not going to
Mm.
lose your salvation. Like, he's going to be there for you, but life is going to be better on earth if you listen to him. You just have to believe in faith that he has something better for you. And then
Mm.
I could really choose in the freedom of my faith and in the freedom of all that I had learned to make a change without feeling like anybody forced me to do it.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more? What would be some other spiritual practices, spiritual moves that help somebody who's really trying to modify or even break up their relationship with alcohol? I mean, it sounds like one of them is clearly this idea of that I'm doing this in freedom. I'm not doing this out of with a God that's scolding me, ready to punish me. What are
Mhm.
some other, sort of these spiritual dynamics and moves?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you haven't had just, you need to have like a one-on-one, a heart to heart with God, like just in like, I like pray out loud in my car. That's just my thing. But just
Yeah.
like really just being honest, and whether it's writing it down or saying it out loud, like just really being honest with God about it and just saying the things you need to say and being open to his voice. I have a journal that I use. My friend Kristen makes these journals. And anyway, they have 4 sections. And the last section of the journal for the day is, what is God saying to you? And I
Mm.
love it because, we answer these questions. And then here at the very end, it's like, what does God say? And it's just like write down whatever's coming to mind. I'm like, oh, this is such a cool way to hear from God. And so I think that can be a powerful way as well. So I would start there. I think any recovery community that you can get into, it like go for it. Like, don't wait to find the
Mm.
perfect community. I spent 2 years in the Luckiest Club, which is Laura McCowan's group that I mentioned Laura before. And that was wonderful. And I went to meetings every day and they're online. And what you realize is like, you don't have to be um, arrested for your second DUI and like getting fired from your job to show up to a meeting. Like, there are people from all walks of life at these meetings, and people just like you, and it's a spectrum. But hearing their stories and hearing them
Mm.
talk about their lives makes you realize that you are not some kind of special. I said this the other day. You're not some special kind of bad. You're not some special kind of sinner. You don't have
Yeah.
like an extra special problem. You're just a person that's dealing with an issue in
Mm.
life that has a lot of stigma attached to it. And
Yeah.
so I think it's really important to find a place where you can just get in there, listen to other people, and to share. I was not successful until I did that, because I tried to do it on my own for a while. And then once
Mm.
I joined a community, everything really changed for me. And then simultaneously, for myself, this isn't really a spiritual practice, it's just sort of my own thing. I love reading sobriety memoirs. And so I remember thinking, if I can just always be reading one of these, like I can make it to 6 months. And so I have probably read like 50 of them, and I love them. I still read them. And I just find them empowering.
Mm.
There's something about it that makes me, that you go, this person was like, a lot of times they really were rock bottom. You're like, this person was rock bottom and look where they are now. And like, I can do that too. And so
Mm.
I find that as a tool very helpful.
It's a form of community with somebody you don't actually have
Right.
met in person per
Right.
se, but
Yeah.
that's right. Well, I want to call out just again, if this is true for you with alcohol or if it's some other substance or behavior that you're wondering, do I need to hit reset on that? I just want to call out a couple things I've heard Ericka just talk about is one, a very simple move you can, if you're unsure about that, is to just ask God, like to have that heart to heart and say, God, if this is something I need to pay attention to, show me. I am open. I'm declaring myself as open to hearing your voice in whatever way. And then to really pay attention in the promptings of your own prayer life, but also in what God brings up to you in terms of your community, your friends. God, if this is something that God wants you to hit reset, he's not going to be completely silent about it as long as you're willing to listen and pay attention. And the second thing is, if you have decided that you're going to hit reset, don't do it alone. Find a community, find people who can support you, who you know are going to be good traveling partners with you on this stage of the journey. Those are great advice for all of us, regardless of whatever we're considering in terms of hitting reset.
And I was just going to say, if you're looking for the community suggestions, you can just go to sobrietycurious.com. And I have this little toolkit that I will send you that has a list of different communities that you can join. So that's sobrietycurious.com, as well as multiple podcasts, my favorite sobriety books, and like a couple of other podcasts that I've been on. So
we've been talking about hitting reset, in particular with alcohol, but again, with truths that are really relevant, I think, to anything that you may be thinking about hitting reset as we begin our year. Ericka, I want to close by exploring just some things that I've just been kind of niggling at the back of my mind as in this conversation. So one is about gender, because you're writing a book in particular about women in faith and how they have a relationship and often have to wrestle in that relationship with alcohol. As somebody who has thought a lot about that, I want to ask you for your observations on, do men and women, as a stereotype anyways, have different kinds of relationships with alcohol? Have you noticed there's some gender differences that we really ought to pay attention to if we want to have this sort of nuanced understanding of how we're relating to alcohol?
Well, what I can say about women and what the research says is that women tend to have higher stress levels and tend to be honestly responsible for more, like in the home, like as mothers. They just do, whether or not it's meant to be and whether or not they even care about that or not. Like, for example, I would say, like, I'm like more in charge of my kids' schedules and doctor's appointments and things, and that doesn't bother me. I actually like being able to do things like that. However, that does mean there's like an unseen sort of stress, and what we see that playing out as is like a lot of times women turn to drinking or some other vice to kind of handle some of that overload. And there's some really fascinating research, and I don't remember if I mentioned this in the Wall Street Journal article, but something like when it comes to female surgeons and female lawyers, they have a much, much higher rate of alcoholism than men in that same field. So when you look at like high stress jobs, you see more and more women turning to alcohol in an unhealthy way than men. And this has been like a trend that's increased since like the 80s because of alcohol marketing, when I think it was probably in the mid 80s, late 80s, when big alcohol shifted to market towards women. Like, so much of alcohol had been like whiskey, beer. All of a sudden they threw a pink label on something and they realized that women would actually pay like 20% more for the same product if it was targeted at them. They call that the pink tax on all kinds of different things. And so as soon as they saw that, it just exploded. So that now everybody knows when you go to the grocery store, you see your like cinnamon whipped cream vodka, and you have your Trulies, your hard ciders. All of that is very, very marketed towards women. And the rate of women's drinking and alcoholism increased right along with that. And so it's like we were being duped and we didn't even know it. And so I think women are particularly vulnerable to this as a sort of like a quick fix maybe, and then it turns into something more long term. And then I think lastly, I'll just say that what we should be doing, of course, is like let's unstress, like let's go to therapy, all this stuff. Well, people are like having trouble paying for groceries. There are single moms. There are all kinds of situations that make it almost impossible to be able to go to therapy, or impossible to be able to like take a day off. And so those are other things that maybe play into the situation for women.
Yeah. Well, what about for men? Because it sounds like, for women, it's because they have the dual stress of added expectations onto, say, their job, plus with their family and household management. Let me put a observation, and this is admittedly, I'm somebody who does not drink, so I'm observing this, and so I want to test this. maybe some of it is stress for men, but I tend to think it's more about loneliness
Mm-hmm.
for men. That actually we have, if you want to call it an epidemic of male loneliness, it shows up in all the statistics of deaths of despair and loneliness and so forth, of how many men, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but there's an incredible amount of men who in surveys say they do not have one single close friend in their life that they can confide to.
Yeah.
And in that kind of loneliness, you're going to turn to, I think, alcohol as a form of consolation, of as a sort of faux companion,
Mm-hmm.
to fill that, try to fill that void of loneliness, or even if it's maybe you do have other male friends in your life. I just noticed that like men in general are awful at making those subtle moves of going to deeper intimacy, and so it's easier to stay sort of at the jovial, convivial level of surface if there's alcohol lubricating these kinds of interactions, rather than having to awkwardly like talk about really
Mm-hmm.
deeper, meaningful things in her life. Speak to the men again. We're a little at a handicap. I don't drink alcohol. You're not a man. So, but like, if we could pool our insights together on this, what might we want to say to the men in terms of how they ought to be considering their relationship to
Well,
alcohol?
I mean, I think so many things are you can look at from that 5,000 foot level, in that marriage rates have declined.
Mm,
When you're married, people like statistically are like happier and less lonely.
yeah,
And
yeah,
also, rates of church going have also declined. And both of those things are really key factors in a lot of happiness levels. So I think those are two things, but also for men, just to, again, like, I think they're maybe less likely to be assessing their choices about alcohol in a more personal way, like we've been talking about. And so I think for anyone, to look at that and like start to ask themselves those questions, and also realize that, um, without friendship, without community, without church, without these things in your life, you really like you really do start to wither in a way. And there's
yeah,
a reason that that a holistically healthy life includes all of these components. There's a reason that God created us for people and community.
yeah,
And so I would say it's harder to get men. I feel like it's harder to get men to go to therapy or join a small
yeah,
group or whatever it may be, join some kind of social thing. But I
yeah.
think it's worth the effort just to see what kind of a even modicum of difference does that make in your mood or your, just the decisions that you're making overall.
Yeah, that's my message to all my male listeners out there, uh, to use this beginning of the year to ask about your relationship to alcohol, to gambling, and to pornography. Not from this legalistic, oh my gosh, I've got to stop because I'm such an awful person. But what is that doing in your life? What void is it trying to address that it's actually failing to address? Is there actually a deeper loneliness, a deeper need for meaning and connection in your life, that we're turning to these faux substances, faux persons, if you will, faux relationships of alcohol, or I would say, like for men, gambling and pornography are two ones that I think are very high on our list. This is a great time of year for us to get curious about our relationship in all of those areas. Ericka, thank you so much for leading us through this very nuanced, subtle, insightful exploration about hitting reset on alcohol, which, again, like I said, I think applies to so many other possible areas that we need to examine. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you
Ericka.
so much.
All right. And listeners, reminder that we will be continuing this series through the month of January on areas that we may need to hit reset, that we may not be too aware of right now, and we need to get a little more curious about. So join us next episode when we continue this question as we gather around the campfire.